I'm Dr. Jan Moynihan. I'm the director of the Rochester Center for Mind-Body Research. There is a large literature that very clearly shows that chronic stress is associated with cardiovascular disease, suppressed immune function, and a lot of this is really driven by an increase in inflammation, which is very intimately linked with metabolic syndrome. So we really do need to pay attention to our stress levels and stop feeling really puritanical about the whole business. On the other hand, the psychology dogma says that unless you think of stress as being stressful, unless you perceive it as stressful, it really isn't stress. So perhaps that is a protective factor in some ways. In order to be stressful, you have to perceive that something is going on with you, that there is sort of a chronic kind of strain on your body. So the brain has a very well orchestrated stress response to stressor exposure. So in response to stress, we upregulate both the hypothalamo-pituitary-adrenal axis, ultimately causing there to be glucocorticoid or cortisol production, which we know is the classic stress hormone. And also the sympathetic nervous system is upregulated, and altogether you get outpourings of catecholamines and these glucocorticoid, these stress hormones. And those have very robust impacts on all of our bodily systems. And it's an interesting phenomenon because acutely the stress response is very adaptive, and that dates back certainly to the whole idea of the fight-flight response. And when exposed to an acute stressor, you need to run, you need to move, and that's good. You need to mobilize energy, you need to shut down processes that aren't helpful in that immediate acute exposure. But as that stress becomes more and more chronic, it becomes more deleterious to our bodily systems. Long term, you see increased blood pressure, you see insulin resistance, you see decreased adaptive immune responses, increased sort of innate immune responses, which are very important in atherosclerosis and other cardiovascular diseases. There is a host of sort of, bad things that start to happen to the body over a long period of chronic stress. And Bruce McEwen at Rockefeller calls this allostatic load, and you can define allostatic load by 14 different parameters. You can actually see in older adults that the more of those parameters that you have, so like increased systolic and diastolic blood pressure, increased cortisol, increased catecholamines, etc., really predicts mortality. Certainly there's a genetic component to it, and there's certainly an environmental component to it, and those people who study stress in the laboratory say that your response to a stressor will depend upon your own hard wiring, what you have experienced in life to date, the nature of the stressor. So it's really kind of depends on a host of different factors. I have learned that chronic stress is very suppressive to what we call the adaptive or antigen-specific arm of immune function, and that's true both in rodents and in humans. So I spent the first, 20 years of my career studying mice, then realized that in the rest of the time I have to do research in the rest of my career, I really wanted to turn my attention to clinical studies and to intervention studies. We know that stress is bad for you, and so now we want to ameliorate stress in clinical populations. So now we're doing a lot of interventions, including a couple of mindfulness-based stress reduction studies. For a practical application, that means that you are aware and in the moment, and you are being non-judgmental and kind of regulating your emotions very well, not in a rigid way, but just being in the moment, being present. And it is a very, very powerful intervention. It's very difficult with all the distractions in our lives to maintain that mindfulness. And we need to take time for ourselves to, reflect on our lives and who we are, and to be more present in the moment as opposed to being very distracted. I was noticing yesterday I was making soup for dinner, and it felt so good to just be focused on something so very simple but really kind of satisfying in the end. If we can lessen our chronic stress load, that's a big step towards taking better care of ourselves.